The habits that shape a life rarely arrive with trumpets. They begin quietly. They enter through ordinary moments, through repeated choices, so small they seem beneath notice, through ways of thinking that feel harmless at first, and then, over time, become the architecture of destiny. I have spent much of my life watching people think about money, chase money, protect money, fear money, and worship money. And after decades of seeing the same anxieties take different forms, I have come to believe that the most expensive mistakes people make are almost never the ones they see clearly in the moment. They are the ones that compound silently in the background, while attention is fixed somewhere else. For many years, people have come to me with questions dressed up in the language of finance. They arrive with charts, statements, market forecasts, retirement projections, inflation assumptions, estate plans, and concern written plainly across their faces. They think they are asking about capital allocation, but usually they are asking something far more personal. They ask, "What should I do with my money?" Yet beneath that question lies another one, more important and more revealing. How should I live the remaining portion of my life in a way that I will not regret? That is the question people mean, even if they do not say it. Money matters. Of course it does. Anyone who says otherwise is either naive or trying to impress you. Money buys margin. It buys independence. It buys options. It reduces friction. It gives you a buffer against humiliation and a defense against certain kinds of fear. But money is still only an instrument. It is not life itself. It is a means, not an end. It is useful precisely because it can be exchanged for things that matter more. And the most important thing it can never buy back once spent is time. That is the great asymmetry of being human. When we are young, time feels so abundant that we spend it carelessly, almost arrogantly. We assume there will always be more. We defer what matters. We postpone conversations, friendships, health decisions, acts of courage, acts of tenderness. Then, later in life, when experience has finally taught us what is worthy of our attention, we discover that time has become the scarce asset. Wisdom arrives just as the runway shortens. Not long ago, I found myself considering a question more interesting than the usual fantasy of being young again. People often ask what a person would do if he could return to the energy of his 20s. But that is not the most useful thought experiment. Youth without judgment can be as dangerous as old age without vitality. The better question is this: what if I could wake up tomorrow with the understanding I possess now, but inhabit the body and circumstances of my 65-year-old self? Not a child, not a beginner, not someone starting from zero, but a person at that curious threshold where the world tells him the major work is done, while life itself may still be asking its most important questions. That question interests me because 65 is a deceptive age. Society presents it as a conclusion. It is treated as the ceremony at the end of the race, the point at which a person is meant to slow down, reduce ambition, become less central to the unfolding of things. But that is a misunderstanding. For many people, 65 is not the final paragraph. It is the beginning of a second education. It is the age at which you stop compounding primarily dollars and begin compounding discernment. The first half of life teaches acquisition. The second half, if you are fortunate and attentive, teaches allocation. And if I were given the chance to live that chapter again, knowing what I know now, there are many things I would do differently. Not because the earlier version of me was a fool. He was not. He worked hard. He was disciplined. He tried to act rationally. By conventional standards, he was doing very well. But the years between 65 and 90 reveal truths that success alone cannot teach. Time exposes false assumptions. It turns theory into evidence. It shows you that the most powerful form of compounding does not happen in brokerage accounts alone. It happens in habits, health, friendship, thought, generosity, and peace of mind. So I would not offer these as regrets in the sentimental sense. Regret is only useful if it can be converted into instruction. I would think of them as wiser revisions, as course corrections made visible only after sailing long enough to understand the current. There are 10 of them, and together they form a different map for the later chapters of life. The first correction concerns the calendar. When people imagine freedom, they often imagine empty space. They imagine days with no obligations and no alarm clocks, mornings without urgency, afternoons without meetings. And on the surface, that sounds luxurious. At 65, I thought something similar. I thought freedom meant release from structure. I imagined time as a wide-open landscape into which I could simply wander. But I eventually learned that unstructured time is not the same as meaningful time. Left undefended, time does not become rich. It becomes porous. Everything trivial seeps into it. If you do not decide in advance what your days are for, the world will decide for you. And the world has a poor sense of priorities. It will offer you noise. It will hand you interruptions disguised as opportunities. It It will consume entire afternoons with matters that do not nourish your mind, your body, or your relationships. The absence of structure is not liberation. Very often, it is leakage. If I were 65 again, I would manage my time with greater seriousness than I ever managed my schedule during my busiest professional years. In business, structure is imposed from outside. Deadlines, demands, obligations, responsibilities. Those things give form to your hours, whether you are wise about them or not. But later in life, structure must be self-imposed, which means your calendar becomes either an expression of your values or evidence of their absence. I would build a time budget the way I once built a capital budget. I would begin by assigning the best hours of my week to the highest return uses. Health first, not someday, not when convenient, not as an aspirational category. I mean actual hours, already spoken for. Then relationships, not I should call more often, or we should spend time together soon, but commitments in ink, shared meals, weekly conversations, walks, trips, visits, then learning, reading, reflection, deliberate solitude. A life becomes meaningful when its most precious resource is directed on purpose instead of spent by accident. Only after those foundational investments were protected would I allow the remainder of the week to be claimed by lesser matters. That is what a rational allocator does. He funds the core before entertaining the peripheral. The same should be true of a life. The second correction would be to redefine wealth itself. Most people, even very intelligent people, spend decades obeying a childish definition of wealth. They reduce it to a number. Net worth becomes the scoreboard. The bigger the number, the more successful the life appears. But age teaches you something uncomfortable. The number is often one of the least informative facts about a person. It tells you almost nothing about whether he sleeps peacefully, whether he is surrounded by love, whether he wakes with purpose, whether he is free in any meaningful sense. I have known wealthy people who were deeply poor in every category that mattered. Their money insulated them from inconvenience, but not from emptiness. Their assets were impressive on paper, and yet their days were crowded with obligations they resented, relationships they did not trust, and habits that steadily eroded their vitality. They were rich in resources and bankrupt in peace. If I were 65 again, I would redesign my balance sheet. I would still track money naturally. Rationality does not disappear just because one becomes philosophical. But I would demote financial capital from first place. I would place at the top of the ledger something more valuable, discretionary, high-quality time, days that belong to you, hours that are not owned by institutions, obligations, or the expectations of strangers. That is real wealth. Right below that, I would list reciprocal love, the number of people with whom trust is deep, uncomplicated, and enduring, the people with whom you can be unguarded, the people who would answer a call in the middle of the night, and for whom you would do the same gladly. That portfolio matters more than most investment portfolios ever will. Money would remain on the balance sheet, but in a supporting role. It would exist to protect the first two assets, not compete with them. Once you see things this way, many decisions become easier. You stop admiring forms of success that require the sacrifice of what success was supposed to purchase in the first place. The third correction concerns health, which I now regard as one of the most brutally honest arenas of compounding. When we are younger, the body is generous. It absorbs abuse. It tolerates neglect. It continues performing even when mistreated. And this creates the illusion that discipline is optional. At 65, a person can still believe that not being obviously ill is the same as being well. That is a dangerous confusion. Health is not merely the absence of breakdown. It is the presence of capacity, energy, mobility, resilience, clarity, and strength preserved over time. If I were 65 again, I would stop treating health as a maintenance issue and start treating it as the central operating system of the rest of life. Every worthwhile experience depends on it. Your ability to travel, to think clearly, to remain independent, to enjoy people, to recover from setbacks, to remain curious, to keep promises to yourself. All of that is downstream from the condition of the machinery. I would approach physical well-being the way I approached any valuable asset that had to endure across decades. I would invest steadily, not dramatically. Exercise would become part of the structure of the week, not a decision renegotiated every morning. Sleep would no longer be treated as expendable. Food would be judged less by momentary pleasure and more by cumulative consequence. Regular checkups would not be acts of fear, but acts of stewardship. The important truth is that decline is often not sudden. It is accumulated. So is vitality. Small deposits matter. A walk matters. Strength work matters. Flexibility matters. The discipline to do what is not urgent because it is profoundly important matters. A healthy body in later life is not merely a medical outcome. It is often the visible record of thousands of intelligent intelligent choices made long before crisis demanded them. The fourth correction would be a more disciplined management of relationships. There is a form of social clutter that many people mistake for connectedness. Life fills with contacts, acquaintances, professional obligations, inherited routines, old loyalties, civic appearances, and social expectations. At 65, many people are carrying around a large inventory of relationships that no longer fit the life they want, but they continue servicing them out of inertia. They attend because they always attended. They answer because they always answered. They remain available long after availability has stopped being meaningful. I would be far more selective. This is not cruelty. It is conservation. Emotional energy is finite. Attention is finite. The capacity for deep presence is finite. If you spread it thinly across dozens of obligations, you wind up underinvesting in the handful of people who actually shape the quality of your existence. That is a terrible exchange. If I were 65 again, I would conduct a relational audit. I would ask, with as much honesty as I could bear, which people deepen my life? Which people leave me more alive, more thoughtful, more generous, more myself? And which interactions merely consume time out of politeness, custom, or vanity? I would gradually release the latter and devote the recovered time to the former. Deep relationships require more than affection. They require undistracted presence. They require initiative. They require repetition, shared experiences, honest conversations, unhurried hours. If I had understood earlier how strongly love compounds when actively tended, I would have built more of my life around that tending. The fifth correction concerns giving. Earlier in life, it is easy to think of generosity as a later stage activity. First you build, then you contribute. First you secure yourself, then you turn outward. That sequence sounds sensible, but it misses something essential. Giving is not merely the final use of a good life. It is one of the ways a good life is created. When you give intelligently, whether money, time, attention, skill, or encouragement, you are not only helping someone else, you are enlarging the frame of your own existence. You are escaping the claustrophobia of self-preoccupation. You are reminding yourself that your resources, whatever their scale, can become instruments of repair, opportunity, dignity, and hope. If I were 65 again, I would integrate giving much earlier and much more deliberately into the design of my days. I would study it, not sentimentally, but seriously. I would ask where my effort could be most effective. I would offer mentorship sooner. I would share knowledge more freely. I would support causes not only with checks, but with engagement. Because giving has an extraordinary effect on the giver. It converts passive comfort into active meaning. And the principle does not depend on wealth. A person of modest means can give richly. A conversation can redirect a life. An introduction can open a door. A vote of confidence at the right moment can become a permanent internal resource for another human being. The returns on generosity are not listed on a statement, but they are among the most satisfying returns available in life. The sixth correction would be to expand learning beyond utility. For much of my life, I learned with a purpose tied to performance. I read to make better decisions, to understand markets, to recognize value, to sharpen judgment. There is nothing wrong with instrumental learning. It can be enormously productive. But later in life, I discovered a different pleasure. Learning that is not required, not monetized, not strategic, but simply driven by wonder. That kind of curiosity is rejuvenating. If I were 65 again, I would deliberately widen the scope of what I studied. I would still read the annual reports and biographies and business histories, because those are old friends. But I would give serious time to subjects with no obvious economic payoff. History, music, architecture, theology, literature, language, natural science. Not because they would improve my portfolio, but because they would enlarge my world. There is something deeply healthy about following a question that has no commercial use. It keeps the mind supple. It reminds you that understanding is a joy, not just a tool. It helps resist the narrowing that often comes with age, when people begin repeating the same opinions, consuming the same inputs, and shrinking inward toward intellectual habit. Curiosity is one of the best antidotes to stagnation. I would also be more willing to become a beginner again. Beginners are humble by necessity. They are clumsy, uncertain, unpolished. That is good for the soul. To learn an instrument, a language, a craft, or even a difficult new subject is to remain in conversation with growth itself. It keeps a person mentally alive. The seventh correction would be a stronger use of the word no. No is one of the great tools of wise living, yet many people spend their lives using it timidly. They say yes out of politeness, out of reputation management, out of guilt, out of the desire not to disappoint. But later in life, the cost of an unconsidered yes becomes enormous. Every commitment consumes not only time, but psychic residue. It occupies thought. It fragments energy. It takes up room in the mind long before it takes up room in the calendar. If I were 65 again, I would would use no as an instrument of design. I would not wait for requests to arrive and then reluctantly defend my time. I would build the defense in advance. Large blocks of unclaimed time would remain intentionally unclaimed, not because emptiness is inherently noble, but because space is necessary for thought, reading, reflection, and joy. The mind needs breathing room. I would resign from more things, decline more invitations, refuse more honorary obligations. Prestige loses value with age if it asks you to spend your remaining time proving things to people whose approval does not improve your life. A wise later life is not crowded. It is spacious, and space is not a vacuum. Space is where insight, gratitude, affection, and calm have room to appear. The 8th correction would involve spending more freely on experiences and less reverently on possessions. I have always had simple tastes, and simplicity can be a virtue. But even a frugal person can misunderstand where money creates the greatest long-term value. Objects depreciate in emotional significance with astonishing speed. A purchase can feel exciting on Tuesday and invisible by next month. Possessions age into background. Some even become burdens, requiring maintenance, storage, insurance, repair, attention. Experiences behave differently. A meaningful trip, a reunion, a shared adventure, a family gathering, a conversation in an unexpected place. These often become more valuable with time, not less. They turn into stories. They are revisited in memory. They strengthen identity. They bind generations together through shared reference points. The dividend keeps paying. If I were 65 again, I would spend more enthusiastically on occasions that gathered people I loved into the same room, the same landscape, the same stretch of time. I would worry less about whether a memory was economically efficient. I would understand more clearly that money sitting idle can protect security. Yes, but money converted into meaningful shared experience can nourish a family for years. The wisest spending often looks extravagant to the wrong observer and conservative to the right one. A luxurious object may impress outsiders and leave no permanent mark on the soul. A week spent with children and grandchildren in full presence may seem intangible on paper, and yet become one of the most important investments a person ever makes. The 9th correction would be to deepen the meaning of the inner scorecard. For years, I spoke about the inner scorecard and the outer scorecard. The outer scorecard asks how things look. The inner one asks whether they are sound. That distinction remains useful, but with age, even the inner scorecard becomes simpler. You begin to see that many sophisticated metrics are merely elaborate detours around the essential question. Did you love well? Did you conduct yourself in such a way that the people whose esteem mattered most had reason to trust you, lean on you, and feel enlarged by your presence? Did ambition leave enough room for tenderness? Did competence coexist with warmth? Were you admirable in ways that actually mattered at the kitchen table, in the hospital room, at the family gathering, in the ordinary afternoon when no audience was present? If I were 65 again, I would ask those questions more often. Before major decisions, yes, but also before small ones. Not merely, is this rational, but what kind of atmosphere will this create in the lives of those closest to me? Not merely, am I right, but is being right here worth the relational cost? Many people win arguments and lose intimacy. They maintain standards and neglect affection. They preserve image and fail to express love clearly. While there is still time, later life strips away a lot of theater. Eventually, you see that admiration from a distance is a poor substitute for love at close range. Reputation travels outward. Love travels inward. And when the years have done their sorting, it is the inward wealth that warms a person. The 10th and final correction would be to embrace simplicity not as sacrifice, but as mastery. The early stages of life are additive by nature. You accumulate more skills, more contacts, more options, more responsibilities, more possessions, more proof. Addition is useful when a life is being built, but beyond a certain point, the art changes. Wisdom becomes less about acquiring and more about editing. The problem is no longer insufficiency, it is excess. Excess commitments, excess noise, excess complication, excess self-importance, excess ownership, excess speed. If I were 65 again, I would subtract more aggressively. I would simplify financial arrangements wherever possible. Complexity flatters the ego and taxes the mind. Elegant solutions are usually underappreciated because they appear too plain to be impressive. Yet much of peace comes from reducing the number of moving parts one must monitor, remember, defend, and worry about. I would simplify possessions, not because owning things is immoral, but because every owned thing quietly asks something of its owner. Attention, storage, maintenance, decision. A lighter life makes room for clearer thought. I would simplify my identity as well. People spend years becoming somebody and then fail to notice when being somebody becomes a heavy costume. There is enormous freedom in needing less applause, less visibility, less proof. A simpler self is often a calmer self, and that, in the end, may be the hidden destination of all these corrections. Calm, not boredom, not passivity, not withdrawal. I mean a deep internal steadiness that comes from alignment. When time is allocated on purpose, when wealth is properly defined, when health is maintained, when relationships are curated with care, when giving is integrated, when curiosity stays alive, when no is used wisely, when money is converted into memories, when love becomes the scorecard, and when complexity is pruned away, life gains a kind of clarity that younger ambition rarely understands. That clarity is not dramatic. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not trend. It does not always look impressive from a distance, but it feels unmistakable from the inside. It feels like enough, and enough, understood properly, is one of the rarest forms of abundance. So if I imagine standing again at 65, with all I know now, I would not see that age as an ending. I would see it as the beginning of a more refined game. The first half of life is often about proving competence. The second can be about practicing wisdom. The first asks, what can I build? The second asks, what is worth protecting, deepening, enjoying, and passing on? The first compounds capital. The second compounds meaning. And the beautiful part is this: one need not wait for a milestone birthday to begin. These principles are not reserved for retirement. They are not locked behind age. A person of 35 can guard time. A person of 45 can redefine wealth. A person of 50 can prune relationships, improve health, practice generosity, use no more wisely, and simplify. The leverage begins whenever awareness begins. That is why the most important change is rarely dramatic. It is usually modest, almost invisible at the start. A better hour in the morning. One walk that becomes a routine. One conversation not postponed. One commitment declined. One evening protected for family. One book begun out of curiosity. One act of giving made habitual. One layer of clutter removed. One truth admitted. Then another. Then another. This is how lives change. Quietly first, then all at once in retrospect. People like to search for the turning point, the grand breakthrough, the single revelation that will transform everything. But life is more obedient to repetition than to intensity. What you do consistently shapes you far more than what you feel strongly about once. That is why the smallest wise decision, repeated long enough, becomes one of the most valuable investments you ever make. So I would end where I began, with habit, with those nearly invisible threads that eventually become the rope of a life. The question is not whether you are weaving. You are. Everyone is. The only question is what you are weaving toward freedom or toward entanglement, toward regret or toward peace, toward a life that looks successful from the outside, or one that feels deeply right from within. Look carefully at your own days. They are telling the truth about your priorities, whether you intend them to or not. If there is a leak, identify it. If there is a neglected asset, protect it. If there is a conversation overdue, have it. If there is a simpler way to live, begin moving toward it. If there is someone you love, make it unmistakably clear while time still allows clarity to matter. You do not need to overhaul everything tonight. In fact, you should not try. Massive reform rarely lasts. Choose one adjustment, just one. Make it small enough to repeat and meaningful enough to matter. Then let time do what time always does. Magnify what is fed consistently. That is the true power available in the later chapters of life, and in every chapter really. Not the power to rewind, but the power to redirect. Not the fantasy of starting over, but the discipline of starting now. Wisdom does not erase the past. It redeems it by changing what happens next. Plant the better habit. Guard the better hour. Choose the better use of energy. Invest in the better relationship. Carry less. Love more clearly. Learn more freely. Give more willingly. Simplify more bravely. And then allow the quiet mathematics of compounding to perform its miracle. So friends, if you enjoyed watching the full video, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I'll be back soon with more in the next video. Take care and see you soon.